Hello, welcome to Documentary Roundtable, Capturing Life Unconditionally. We'll share with you how to create films that totally engage your audience. I'm your host, Carole Dean, president from the Heart Productions, founded in 1993, dedicated to supporting and nurturing independent filmmakers. And we have three brilliant directors whose films are garnering considerable attention. So I'll let them introduce themselves and they can tell us where we can see their film. So let's start with Dick Johnson Is Dead. Kirsten, would you be kind enough to go first?
Hi, I'm Kirsten Johnson, and this is my father, Dick Johnson. And this film, Dick Johnson Is Dead, is currently streaming on Netflix, which is kind of a miracle to me that it can be seen all over the world. And I consider it, in a strange way, part two of a trilogy that began with Camera Person, which was a film that I made a few years ago, sort of looking back at my experience as a documentary cinematographer working for many different directors. And that film is deeply serious, I would say, as serious as a heart attack. And this film isn't. This is a film full of laughs. And in some ways, this film has really opened me up even further than Camera Person did to the possibilities of our cinematic language when it comes to documentaries. So I'm really delighted to be here, Carole. Thank you so much for having us. And I'm much looking forward to this conversation.
Me too. Thank you. Allison.
I'm Allison Otto. I'm the co-director of The Love Bugs. It's streaming now for free on the POV website, and it was part of the POV Short Season 3 lineup. And it's this story of these two aging entomologists who kind of quietly amassed the world's largest private collection of insects and then decided to give it all away.
And where can we see your film, Allison?
Oh, it's streaming on POV on the POV website.
On the POV website. Great, thank you. Elizabeth.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth Lowe, and I'm the director of Stray, which is my first feature-length documentary after many years of making shorts. The film follows three stray dogs as they wander through Istanbul and eavesdrop on different human dramas that unfold around them. And through their eyes and ears, you get a sense of a city, the life of the people who live on the margins, in sharing public spaces and sharing the streets with them on the streets of Istanbul.
Thank you. That's excellent. Okay, so now I'd like to have each of you tell us why you decided to break away from the more traditional documentary storytelling. And let's start with Allison.
Well, I think the story of Charlie and Lois O'Brien, it was so quirky that I didn't want to do like a traditional old school documentary with talking heads. And so I just kind of really leaned into the quirkiness of their collection and the quirkiness of them as individuals to kind of tell this story about their love of nature and the nature of love.
And the love of each other. They really are love bugs.
Yeah, hence the title. Yes, they would finish each other's sentences. They knew each other so well that they could predict the rhythms of the other person. And yeah, it was like filming a love story unlike anything I've ever seen before.
Yes, and I loved it when they would each get up and walk off camera separately. That you couldn't have asked for anything better than that.
Yeah, that was something that wasn't planned at all. But as I saw that happens in the beginning, as I saw it happening, I was just like, I gotta just keep letting the camera roll. But none of it was staged at all. So every single funny thing they did actually happened.
Yes, you felt that. It was natural. Great. So let's hear, Kirsten, why you broke away.
Well, I love both of these films, and I love the way that both Elizabeth and Allison are sort of in a back and forth with the protagonists of their film. And I always think, a film teaches us how to make it, and the people that we're filming with sort of open up our imagination to what's possible. But I would say for me, I actually, in some ways, don't even think of this as a film anymore. I think of it as an experiment with life and death and image making. And when I was making Camera Person, I had given footage that I had shot of my mother years before to the editor I was working with, Nels Bangerter. And he did this sort of remarkable thing of putting footage of my mom alive after a shot of my mother's ashes.
Oh,
And I hadn't seen the footage of my mom in a long time. And when I saw the cut, I really thought for just a second that my mom was alive. And it was such a thrilling, it was the feeling of her being like resurrected.
mhm.
And it was so strong for me that I thought a lot about like, how does cinema keep people alive? And what is cinema in some ways but a hallucination? It's images and sounds that take us into an emotional state. And, you know, I think about Elizabeth's film where she's allowing sort of us to open up and think about the consciousness of dogs and how they interpret the world from their point of view. For me, my film was just like, can I play with the time travel that cinema allows? Can I play with where is this edge between what is the present and what is the future? What is life and death?
I gotta say, when I watched your film last night, the two most powerful scenes for me were the music video sequence and the sequence where it was during Halloween and he was trapped in almost like a haunted house, and it really felt like you're seeing what's going on inside his head. And it just, like, I actually started crying when I was watching it because it was so powerful and moving and felt so it resonated so deeply.
Oh, thank you so much, Allison. I mean, what's so interesting is that the timeline in an edit room is a place that we can sort of move back and forth in time. But in terms of our process in making this film, particularly that moment where, you know, I'd taken my dad out trick-or-treating with the kids, and then he'd said he was tired. We'd taken him back to an apartment of friends and left him there watching TV. But when we came back, he was in those friends' bed and he was terrified and he didn't know where he was. And I was just sort of beside myself because it was the first time that it had happened that I had left him somewhere by himself and it wasn't okay. So I didn't see it coming. And what I think is so amazing about doing observational documentary is that you don't see things coming. You experience truly unexpected things. But in this process, we realized we could go sort of backwards into time and try to create an imaginary space that was my father's internal space inside that apartment when he felt lost and didn't know where he was. But that was sort of step one. Step two, like we imagined doing that. But then when we got on the set, what was so extraordinary was that my father by that time was fairly advanced in his dementia. It was near the end of the making of the film. And we had him in costume. I was in costume. We were in this set, but we had an open door that was going to be the space in which we were going to project the dementia care facility, the nursing home horror that was the future. But there was nothing there. There was just lights there. There was no intimation that there was a nursing home there. And I sat down with my father and, while waiting for the shooting to begin, and he said, "Where are we?" And I said, "Well, we're in this place that we imagined you were in." And he said, "Well, it's very strange because this place is reminding me of the feeling I had when we were deciding whether or not to put mom into a nursing home."
Mm.
And it was just like, how? How was that possible? But so it was sort of like this, sort of weaving in and out of our own consciousness, weaving in and out of time, weaving in and out of fiction and documentary, but it all happening in this really organic way. It was pretty amazing experience because he became more lucid in that moment, more able to communicate with me psychologically than he had been in a really long time.
Wow.
That's amazing.
I mean, when you bring up these moments from your film, and I think both of you use sort of an additional layer or visual language as a tool in cinema to explicate things that are either deeply emotional, and you visualize it. And I think one of the scenes that I love the most in your film, that I was really blown away just as a documentary filmmaker and imagining a documentary filmmaker venturing into this territory cinematically, was when the chair in the office kind of just lifts
Yes.
very subtly, and that level of magic just really struck me on a not just a technical level, but that you imagined that, and that, but then also you exercised it with such restraint, sort of masterful restraint. We get into this space of whimsy, and it's emotional and powerful. And Allison, also your use of the graphics and the way that the insects and the montages of insects really allows you to sink into, become passionate about these bugs in the same way that the protagonists are. And with my film, I think very much it was trying to use also the language of cinema, but in a much simpler, I suppose, in a much rudimentary way, a primal way, where it's just audio and visually trying to transport you to recenter the world away from a very familiar way of looking, and trying to use sound design where frequencies are heightened and where human dialogue is secondary to the ambience of the city, and visually always staying at the dog's height to try to defamiliarize you on a very visceral level, so that you are processing the world on an unconscious level because of the way that my camera is telling you to look at things. And that the soundscape is designed in a way that hopefully takes you out of sort of like what you've been comfortable with in the past, and cinematically transports you into a space that is attempting to be canine, even though of course it's not possible fully.
I think that's one of the things that stuck out the most for me when watching your film, is just that the audio was such that I felt like I'm hearing what a dog hears. And I think that was like a really unique way to approach it. And was that like something that you thought about from the beginning, that you planned, or was it kind of like one of those happy accidents?
Yeah, I was really actually inspired by Sweetgrass. I don't know if you have seen that. Sweetgrass was made by Lucien Kesting-Taylor and Verena Paravel, these filmmakers from the Harvard Sensory Ethnography Lab, and they embed with cowboys, sort of Montana's last cowboys, and they're embedding with the sheep who are being herded across the plains. And in the film, if you pay attention to the soundscape, which was designed by Ernst Carole, who eventually collaborated with me on Stray, he pays a lot of attention to not allowing you to fully hear the human dialogue, for all the horse sounds and the sheep sounds to really become primary, or at least equal to the human dialogue. And so that was something that we were very conscious of when we were designing and mixing the sound of Stray.
Elizabeth, one of my favorite filmmakers is Jacques Tati, who has a lot of presence of dogs in his very humorous cinema. And he is sort of famous for having employed an assistant for a year to follow stray dogs and take notes about things that they did. And because there's all kinds of really sort of hilarious things that dogs do in his movies, but he basically spent all of this research time just seeing like, what are dogs up to when we're not paying attention to them? So I thought of that when watching your movie, and the thing that I found so sort of exhilarating about your movie is that you activate us as viewers to think about the world in a completely different way. And also, Istanbul is one of my favorite cities in the world, and I so wish that I could be there more often than I can. And that it's this city that has these sort of incredible vistas, but also you get to go on ferries between parts of the city. So it feels like you're sort of out in the sky and the ocean when you're in the middle of this remarkable city. And so I just was thinking about how transportive, in both cases, your movies are, particularly in this moment of the pandemic, where we sort of, we can't go into the world And yet, even if we could go into the world, would we be going in the way of the like obsessive collector or going in the way of the wandering dogs? But I love how much you wake us up in your film, Elizabeth, to the way to be differently in the world.
Thank you so much. That means so much here. I would love to, and I've never heard of Jacques Tati. I have to look him up now.
Oh my goodness. He's one of the great users of sound in cinema. You know, he's known for Monsieur Hulot's Holiday and My Uncle, but he has films that are just almost entirely based on how the sound is constructed, but it's very controlled and made, but hilarious.
Wow. I mean, just you bringing that up makes me want to hear who are both of your influences, Allison and Kirsten, in the making of The Love Bugs and Dick Johnson is Dead. Like your aesthetic references, whether they were literary or film, or whether you had none at all, because you know it's so original.
I think for mine, I was very influenced by Wes Anderson, who I love, and I know people either really love him or really hate him. But I think I wanted to kind of, I was inspired by that aesthetic to do a lot of symmetry, because the O'Briens were such a symmetrical pair, and they were so precise about their collection that I think, but there's also a ton of whimsy to them, that I was really inspired by that. And then as far as like our soundtrack, we did a live studio recording, and we were really like thoughtful about the way that we approached the music. So it wasn't just something that was kind of thrown together at the end. And I guess with that one, I'm inspired by the composer of Up, the animated film that features a dog. So I was, inspired by those. And then with the aesthetic for the animations, we wanted I was inspired by those old vintage biological field journals. And we wanted to kind of tap into that, the watercolor drawings and sketches and everything, because Charlie kept a ton of these old journals. And so we wanted to really play into that to kind of bring his stories to life.
You know, the Beetle Queen of Tokyo, right?
Yes,
You know
that was one of the first documentaries I saw that inspired me to become a documentary filmmaker.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's what's so fun about cinema in a way, is that we see these things that help us imagine what we wish to imagine, and then we also see things that are like so beyond our own capacities, right? And so I have so many different things that inspired Dick Johnson. I sort of let everything in, but I would say like sort of the audacity of Harold and Maude, of Jackass, of Monty Python. You know, I had this real like exuberant absurdist inspiration. I also I love collage. So I love Max Ernst and Jacques Prévert and Saul Steinberg, and this moment of bringing heaven together was so fun, sort of how the aesthetic of that emerged. And it really came out of very simple, basic things like, oh, you know, I can't have an actor play my mom. It has to really be my mom. So, you know, can it be a mask of her? And then once we came up with the idea of masks, then we could sort of play in all these different ways. And also my father's dementia meant that we wanted to do it in slow motion so we could expand the present time with him. Mm-hmm. And then it was like, oh, we could bring in this sort of Adventist, Seventh-day Adventist aesthetic of heaven, but we could also bring in sort of, you know, this sort of fantasy of things moving in slow motion, and looking at, you know, sort of all of the wonderful dance movies. I'm a big Busby Berkeley fan. But it was really interesting. We watched recently I have 9-year-old twins, and we've been doing like movie hour. And we recently watched The Gold Diggers of 1937 by Busby Berkeley. And there's there's these crazy scenes with masks in his movie. And I was just like, how is it? Like, I haven't ever seen it, and yet it's in conversation with my movie. And I sort of love that, the way, you know, you say, Elizabeth, like you saw Sweetwater and you're like, okay, my mind's just been blown, but then you take it in such a different place than where Sweetwater went. And that's what I love about how we sort of riff off of each other, but also end up inventing something completely our own.
Your that dance sequence really reminded me of like a Fred Astaire, Ginger Rogers. Was that kind of also something you had in mind?
Yeah, we definitely watched a lot of those movies too, and the dance sequences of those. But I mean, it was so comical because because we were doing it in slow motion, we didn't have music. So there was no rhythm they could dance to. So it was like this sort of back and forth of these awkward moments and then trying to rebuild them, which in some ways is what dementia does to you. You're sort of always stopping and starting in time and having a hard time finding your rhythm. And so a lot of that sequence came together after only many iterations. After, sort of composing a song for it, then breaking that song up in the sound mix and adding real sound. And so we did lots of back and forths. We sound mixed many times. We edited many different ways and tried things out because I'd never done anything funny before. So it was just like, we got to try it. You only can figure it out by doing it.
It was so funny, but also so sad. And but it was this weird mixture of both of those things, and then it felt like a psychedelic trip, but like a good kind.
Love it. Well, I have to say, insects are psychedelic trips.
Some of them are. They do. They
really are.
One at the end that looks like a little disco ball that was just otherworldly.
Yeah, I love what you're saying about sort of the tension between symmetry and then just the sort of madness of biodiversity, like the tension between those two things, and then the tension between two organisms, the couple who are in synchronicity but are still two different people, even though you're not sure that they are at some point, right?
Yeah, that's a really good way of putting it. I'll have to remember that because yes.
Kirsten, I have to say, like, when you talk about like filmmaker watching something and it makes you want to push yourself more, watching Dick Johnson, I feel like did that for me. It's the kind of film that I would never imagine. Like I wouldn't have to, I don't feel like I have the capacity to make it, but it inspires me to want to challenge myself. Like hearing you talk about it, it sounds like it was this process of discovery and learning for you, trying new things. And when I saw your film, I just felt like, wow, you opened a whole toolkit of cinema that is, not normally doesn't normally feel like the right of documentarians, but you did it in this way that was reserved with a lot of restraint, which is what I respect so much. And then I started to imagine, like, how can I start to push myself into spaces of discomfort?
Oh, that means so much to me, Allison. Because I feel like we if you look at all of us, it's not, Carole has brought us here because we're all women, right? And we are, different generations, all of us, between Carole, you and me. And the fact is, this world of cinema has been, to a great extent, been dominated by people who had money, by men, by people who were sort of the class elites of their world, whether it was in Japan or in Iran or in France or in the United States. It's been dominated by simplest stories. It's been dominated by the erasure of certain people's stories and, sort of the legitimizing of like histories of military oppression and all kinds of like pretty negative things as well as extraordinary things. And I think the fact is we just haven't seen yet the cinema that we are capable of making. And we haven't seen yet, I mean, if you look at this year's crop of films made by women, they are all among the most innovative. I can't even say the word. They're so innovative. I can't even say innovative. But like, you look at Nomadland and like the way that Chloe is pushing the form. You look at The Assistant and the way Kitty Green is pushing the form. The list goes on. And I think there's no question in my mind that the people who are like as we believe we can become filmmakers, which I think was hard to believe for a while because it was true. Like no one was letting us in. And I'm in the American Society of Cinematographers, 5% of us are women.
Mm-hmm.
And there have been obstacles to people with different visions entering, but now we're finding these subversive ways in, and I think that the world is interested because we haven't seen anything like it. Like it was such a joy to see Michaela Cole's I May Destroy You. It was just
Yeah.
been waiting to see that, been waiting to see small acts, these ways in which it's like, yes, these breaths of fresh air coming in because we haven't seen these worlds in these ways. So I do think that this is like our task now in some ways, is to like encourage each other to imagine our own form and to keep breaking form and keep breaking these boundaries between what cinema is valued. And I think a lot about sort of why documentary has been less valued as a form. And I think there are many reasons for it. But in some ways, one of them is we have to contend. The world that we depict is still out there. So it forces the audience to contend with that. And that's not always comfortable as compared to a fiction movie where it's like, oh, okay, Anthony Hopkins did a great performance as a man with dementia, and he's okay. Whereas Dick Johnson is not okay, right? And what do you do with that? What do you do with those things in the world? But I can't even wait to see what you make next, both of you. And it makes me really happy that I'm part of let's bust open the doors.
Elizabeth, I got to say, when I watched yours, I really had that reaction of someone who's pushing the boundaries. And I remember watching, I was like, oh my gosh, how did she do that? I'd love to hear how you did it. But also, in the end, it made it feel like these dogs, you see the best and the worst of humanity, but also these dogs become almost more human than the people in terms of their humanity. But I really want to hear how you did this.
Yeah, speaking to what both of you are saying, I really increasingly believe that the world, the portrait of the worlds that are seen by people and beings on the peripheries, when you're away from the centers of power, when you're not the center, that view is the most accurate of society. Like ask a Black person their perception of police, or ask women their perception of men, or the hierarchies within the workplace. That's a much more accurate view than if you were to ask people who have been very privileged, whether through their gender, sex, or class. And for me to pursue sort of the viewpoint of dogs, it felt like an experiment in what would happen if you left a narrative up to dogs. And when we were making it, we were very tempted to try to impose sort of our top-down themes, the themes that we were interested in, like all the rise of authoritarianism, the influx of refugees, women's rights, people that were fighting for that in Turkey. But we realized very soon that wasn't authentic, and that we really, in production, we really just chose a dog, which happened to be Zeytin. She rose up as our star because she didn't inevitably sort of follow us back. She was one of these really stubborn dogs that wouldn't follow us, was very independent. And so she fulfilled the premise of the film, which is, what does it feel like to be enveloped in a non-human agency and a will taking you through a city? And so we let her sort of lead us to all the spaces that are seen in the film, so that there are these moments of levity and gravity, which I feel like this balance between levity and gravity is something that both of your films kind of deal with and grapple with it really delicately. And I'd love to hear that, because both of your films deal with life and death in a way that I feel like my film doesn't totally get there.
Go, Allison. Tell us about levity and gravity in your film.
Oh gosh, I mean, those are two of my favorite emotions to mix, is poignancy and humor, and I think they go hand in hand. And I didn't really have to do anything to make it, happen at all. Charlie and Lois they were doing that sort of stuff naturally, like the scene where they're sitting on the couch and they're talking about death. All I had to do was turn on the camera and ask Lois, hey, what's this book you've got over here? And then she started showing me and just talking about how that book is, they send it to the elderly to help them plan for death. And it just became this humorous thing as they started to go through everything that they needed to do. But for me, I feel like I didn't really have to do anything or any planning for it. It just sort of happens naturally, and I can see it kind of intuitively unfolding. And so I just let it unfold.
I totally had to force it. I mean, I'm incredibly, I'm incredibly passionate about how messed up this world is. I've spent 30 years, sort of trying to figure out, is there a way to support more human rights through filmmaking? All of the things that you mentioned about that are troubling in Istanbul, Elizabeth, I would have been right there with you, saying like, that's what we need to focus on, because all of that has been made invisible, and how can I make it visible? But for me in this situation, I had been through my mother's Alzheimer's, and I had just cried my way through it. There were some funny moments, but I just was sort of devastated over and over again by the unexpected losses of her little by little. And when I came up with this idea for Dick Johnson of like bringing humor to it, I don't think I was even yet consciously aware that my dad had dementia. I had just had this crazy dream where a man sat up in a coffin and he said, "I'm Dick Johnson and I'm not dead yet." And it was like, just like this sort of wake up call. But what I knew was I couldn't handle more grieving. I just couldn't handle it. And so I was like, I'm going to make this movie funny if it kills me, but it wasn't easy for it to be funny. Like my dad makes bad jokes, can't act his way out of a paper bag. And we had to sort of force the absurdity and in some ways in the edit room, then also surprise the audience with like, I am as earnest can be. Boom, I just killed my dad, and part of that change of tone, I can't do that. I can do it when I'm talking, but it has to be like, ooh, build this a little bit, then build that a little bit, then come back at it, so we did many attempts at, say, the sound of the horn that my dad's best friend blows. We did many different sounds over that. That's not really the sound that he made. We had sounds that were much different, so that we were taking the raw material of documentary and then just twisting it a little bit. So I couldn't just do it. I had to go back and forth and try again. And I got braver as I went on. I didn't start as brave as I became.
What prompted you to become braver? Was it just trying things out, or was it just kind of, you got to the point where
it was kind of desperation. I would say just because I respect my father so much. He's a serious person who had a serious career, who treated his patients well, who was well loved by his friends. He's also like a funny person, but I was taking his life and gonna make something of it. And I had sort of said to him, I'm going to make something that allows people to cry, but also we got to laugh. And he was like, you got to laugh. So it was sort of, I had to live up to this challenge I'd created for us, because it just didn't seem worth it to do a terrible job of throwing my father's reputation, of his entire life out the window. If I was going to do it, I had to do it with a splash. And he helped, he was a collaborator in the process, just like the dogs were, like you're saying, your main lead dog, Elizabeth, was sort of not having the, I don't want this serious explanation of things. I'm going to go over here. My dad would see certain things and be like, that's not that funny. and then, so the fall down the stairs, we were like, oh, we could twist the leg more, we could add more blood. And he was like, then he would respond to that. So he was our first audience as well as a collaborator of testing and laughing at things. And he allowed me to go further than I would have. Your dog, she was like, come on, like, stop being so literal. Come with me, right?
Totally. Yeah.
And I do
That's
think
so
literalism is our enemy.
I love that your film is a reflection of your dad's tastes in humor, like the limits of his boundaries for what's funny and what's that like razor thin edge between darkness and being hilarious. I love that that's his vision because he was guiding you and setting up the fences.
You were talking, Elizabeth, about like the top down issues you went into the film thinking that you really wanted to cover. But I think once you started following that dog, all of those issues came to the foreground just kind of organically. And they were more powerful, at least for me as a viewer that way, rather than being like forced onto me. It just, you saw it all and happening, the treatment of refugees and women's rights. It's that whole scene where the guy is telling the woman not to text, or was it to respond back to a text or something?
Yeah, an Instagram friend invite.
That, to me, covered everything. It hit home very viscerally about women's rights issues there.
And the absurdity.
Can I also just recognize you in this moment, Carole? It's so interesting that you, one, curated us. You brought us together as a set of people and a set of films. We don't know each other, but you trusted that we could lead our own conversation, as opposed to saying, I'm going to prove to whoever's watching this film or this Zoom or whatever we're doing, how much I, Carole Dean, know about all of these films and about cinema and about these people. And I think, it sort of, everyone had said such remarkable things about you. And I'm just like, so I have to say, this is one of the rare Zoom panel conversations I've had where, like, we as filmmakers have been allowed to ask each other questions. And I would just like to say, like, as we are breaking the form, you are breaking the form. And I really appreciate, like, you're not like, okay, that's not interesting anymore, let me ask the next question. I do want to know more of what you're curious about also, but I just want to say, like, it's moving to me the way in which you have created this space in which we get to talk about what we want to talk about. And it's rare.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. I think documentary filmmakers are the smartest, most intelligent, creative beings on the planet. And I think they are the least funded, but I think that you are our greatest asset. And there's a lot of responsibility resting on your shoulders to bring us information, guidance, and all the things that you do, which I sincerely appreciate. But I would love to go back and talk to you about cinematography, because you were talking about how hard it is for women in the industry. Well, Brianne Murphy was a friend of mine, and she was an actress who wanted to be a cinematographer. She learned everything about filmmaking, in front of the camera, behind the camera. And so she found a job, because this was when the Cinematographers Union, the 659, was father to son. It was a cameraman. So she goes in to see the head of the cameraman's union and says, I have a job I know I can take. Here is a letter from so-and-so, and he'll hire me. I have the experience, and I want a union. And the man at that time said, over my dead body. That was his response. Well, Brianne Murphy had a lot of tenacity, just like all of you. So she waited. And as soon as he died, the next president came in, okay, maybe 4 or 5 years. And here she comes again. I have a resume. I have a job. I can do it. I want in the union. And he said, Brianne, thank you so much for coming. And he actually pulled the drawer open and dropped her resume and closed it. and said, we'll think about it. At least he was nicer. So time goes on, and he gets a call from the American Cancer Association. They want to do a documentary on women's breast cancer. So they call up to the head of the union and say, do you have a female cinematographer? We need one for this show. And he said, of course I do. Just a minute. This is the story she tells from the woman that was looking for the cinematographer. Here it is. Yes, of course we have a woman, he said, and I'll contact her and I'll put you two together. Well, she worked for 3 or 4 years on that. And she ended up on a lot of shows, but Little House on the Prairie, if she was sick, they didn't shoot.
Wow.
That's how much they loved her.
Oh, amazing. Well, I'm laughing because in the making of Dick Johnson, there was a moment when my brother said to me, over my dead body, when, my original idea for the funeral was that we would have my father in an open casket in front of the congregation. And my brother was just like, over my dead body. That's not happening. And I love my brother, and he's very smart. And in many ways, he was brilliant to say, like, no, that doesn't work, because it would have been a disaster. My dad would have been popping up and out of the casket, and it would have been funny while it was happening, as opposed to, having the gravitas of really being his funeral that it did. We responded to that constraint from my brother by creating a workaround, right? We filmed on a different day with the green screen, with the casket in the same space. And it ended up giving us lots of material for the film and giving us lots more ideas. And I think ultimately was much more interesting solution. And I think that's what we all have to think about, sort of no matter who we are, men, women, black, white, Asian, too old, too young, all of it, right, is that there are barriers in place. Not all of them are out of the malevolence of the people who are inside the barrier. Some of them are, but some of them are just things have been built and people can't imagine what they've never experienced. And so you gotta be like both subversive, friendly, wily, have a sense of humor, have tenacity. But I think the thing to not be stopped by it. So, I wanted to respect my brother. And when I really thought about what he was saying to me, it made more sense. It was a good barrier. And it allowed me to come up with a new idea. And that was a lot of what I thought about in Dick Johnson, is just like, how do we get around death? How do we get around dementia? Like, these sort of terrible things in life that stop us. Is there a workaround? And I think that's what cinema is sort of these experiments in workarounds. And it can be so magical what it gives back to us, as we see in both of Allison and Elizabeth's films.
Cinematography is like one of my favorite aspects of filmmaking. And so I love talking about it. And I know that when Elizabeth, I specifically wanted to ask you, like, how did you film that? How did you film the dog? Were you using like a rig? I thought I read something about how you had like a GPS on the dog so you could find her every morning. How'd that happen?
Yeah, we actually got sponsored by Tractive GPS. They're these pet tracking collars for those of you with pets, and they last 3 days without batteries. So at the end of our shoot day every day, we would put the collars onto the dogs, and then we'd be able to track them with our phones and our iWatches sort of overnight, seeing where they'd been. And then in the morning, we'd be able to find them again. And the funny thing was, because it's Istanbul, and if you put a tracking collar on a dog, somebody's going to probably take it. And so sometimes we would get up in the morning and we would track to like a hookah bar, and we'd be like, where's the dog? But, of course, the dog wouldn't be there. And, obviously nobody was going to sort of confront us and tell us they took the collar. But one of the remarkable things that I also loved about being in Istanbul is when I would try to put collars on the dogs to track them, people would come up to me very concerned saying, hey, these dogs are not to be taken. These are the community's dogs. They belong here. Like, they're not meant to be constrained or taken away. This is their territory, which I found really moving, that people bothered to step into the lives of street dogs who, went by different names depending on what cafe they were in. And that level of engagement from the community, and that level of, I don't know, I was just so moved by it. But in terms of how we shot it, I tried to experiment with sort of GoPro cameras strapped onto dogs. And there's one scene in particular where I happen to not be filming when the young men are stealing the cartel, the little puppy. And that would actually, I'm so relieved that I didn't know they were stealing, because that would have been a moment where I would have had to wonder, should I step in? Should I stop them? But Zayton happened to have the GoPro on her, and so she recorded that moment. But I would have loved to make the whole film from GoPro, because then it would have truly been this sort of immersive, what do dogs do when we're not looking? But at the same time, I knew it would be really alienating for audiences to be nauseated in this way. And I also wanted to treat the dogs with the same level of care and beauty, and production value that human actors and actresses are afforded in, fiction films, because I knew already it was going to be a hump that audiences would have to get over, that this is not a human subject, and to give the benefit of the doubt to this non-human subject, that they had as rich an inner life as you would presume Gwyneth Paltrow on camera does when she's just not speaking and just staring into the camera. I wanted people to afford Zayton that level of treatment. And so I tried to elevate the look as much as possible. So we ended up with a C300 and camera. And then sometimes we also got a grant from ARRI to have that fictional associations, and an easy rig and a gimbal. And I kind of just crouched low and followed these dogs. And that became so much a part of the process, encountering the dogs, encountering the people, and people encountering me, being fascinated with the dogs. That all became a part of the spirit of the film. And I think if you look closely, you can sense the relationship of the dogs with me. There are moments that when she wanders into traffic, I'm trusting her completely that she knows what she's doing and is not going to get us killed. And every time it would be fine. So I think this giving up, and I think that's something that both of you did, giving up of yourselves to your participants and your collaborators, can be a really beautiful process. I'd love to hear you guys talk about that. Or Allison, with the couple, did you ever, a big question that kept coming up in my mind is, when they kill, when they're killing the bugs, sort of like that, there's such a contradiction. Like, they love bugs, and at the same time they're just whacking trees to like collect them all. Was that something that you talked about with them or examined?
Not really, actually. I just would kind of let them do their thing. I know I had asked at one point why they need to collect so many, and they were telling me how it's much easier to work with a specimen rather than to try to identify it in the field and to try to look at its legs and everything. But yeah, I would just kind of let them do their own thing. I filmed with the C300 as well, and then I used I think it was like a 14 to or 17 to 40 lens, a Canon lens, because I really wanted that wide feeling to kind of play into the symmetry of everything. And then I used a 100mm macro L series lens to really get super up close with the insects. But a lot of it was handheld when I was just following them around. And I really didn't try to make anything happen. But yes, it would occasionally go through my mind as to, I feel guilty that they're killing these insects. But then I tried to see the world from their perspective of, they revere these insects in terms of their scientific importance. And for them, it was part of furthering science.
I think what we're all talking about is the different positioning that you find yourself in, physically, emotionally, politically, when you are in relation to other beings and with this machine of the camera in your hands. And, Elizabeth, I'm glad that you didn't, that the GoPro solution wasn't the solution, because I think I still really believe like we feel the person um, in the making as well as the machine, sort of which lens, like you absolutely had to use a macro lens, Allison, but also using a wide lens gave you a sort of a bug's eye view of the world, right? But the fact that you as the filmmaker in the process of like both sort of the exhilarating, like where's the GPS going to lead us every morning discovery part of it, but then for you to be there and realize there are all these people in Istanbul looking out for these dogs. You didn't know that when you started to make the film, but when you sort of became the like, you moved in closer to the dogs, then other people said, hey, what are you doing so close to those dogs? Are you going to hurt them? Are you going to help them? What are you doing to them? Are you trying to control them? And I think that that's what I'm so interested in, sort of the way I think about cinematography. It's about relationships. Images are relationships, and they're not relationships that are static, but they're relationships that sort of inform us and change, and they're moving the way all human relationships are moving. But I think if we're trying to deal with not human protagonists, then it becomes like this really interesting sort of imaginative leap about what is that point of view. But you also know something about the point of view of audiences, Elizabeth, and you're thinking like, how do I get the audience to value and look at this dog? But I just adore the idea of like tracking the GPS through the night and sort of imagining where the dogs might be. And I think like that might be the new space of imagination for you, like in that, in the sort of like, where did that dog go in the middle of the night, and just like going into sort of the fantasy land of what that could actually be.
I was going to ask both of you, when you're actually doing the cinematography itself, do you think of it clinically, or do you tend to like fall into more of a zone, an intuitive zone, when you're actually filming the verite?
I don't think I think of anything clinically. I'm definitely not a clinical person, but I mean, I think, I learned things from making Camera Person. I didn't realize I was so in the footage, that there was so much evidence of me in the footage. And I took learning that into Dick Johnson is Dead. And so, for example, with the scene like the ambulance, where, we're trying to imagine a situation in which my dad has a heart attack. It's like, okay, we know this cinema language already. Kirsten Johnson, like anyone watching this film knows that Kirsten Johnson does certain things with the camera. Well, what would Kirsten Johnson do in this moment of an actual heart attack happening? Like, I definitely wouldn't bring my big camera, but I would have my cell phone, and then I would be like torn about whether I would use it or not. And then if it really got real and I dropped it, I wouldn't pick the camera back up, like just the way I didn't pick the camera back up when I went to hug my dad when he was comforting me about his dementia, So I'm trying to track almost in real time what the cinema language is teaching me about myself and other people, and then adapting it, because I believe the audience is incredibly sophisticated at this point. We all have camera phones. We all watch lots of movies. We all can read what is false, even as people try to, confuse us about where, the realism is or isn't. But, I just found the January 6th invasion of the Capitol so interesting from an image making point of view, because we had the embodiment of so many different perspectives happening in that situation. You had journalists of color inside the Capitol afraid for their lives filming. You had people thinking, I'm not really with this group, but I want to come in and I want to film what they're going to do. You had people documenting their own excitement about being in there. And it all yielded different types of cinema language. But together, it sort of became this mosaic that's still revealing things to ourselves about ourselves, right? And I think that's where we're at this very exciting moment in cinema history. And I feel like both of your films speak to that.
I think that's also something that I really discovered through this first filmmaking venture in the long form, this process of the gift that cinema gives you to the filmmaker, this process of self-discovery and realizing that your presence is undeniable, even as you try to be supposedly objective. And it's so highly subjective. Like, even I know I thought I knew the dogs, and I didn't think the dogs were really watching me, because I thought, oh, I'm following the dogs around. They're showing me their life. But so often in the footage, in the edit, which is the gift of being a filmmaker and the gift of the act of recording and then being able to watch something happen again because it's been captured by a camera, I would notice that there were so many instances where, like Zayton, there's that moment where she sits in the middle of heavy traffic. And at the time in the field, I wondered, like, what is going on in this dog's mind? Like, what is her intention? Why would she do this ridiculous, absurd act that's a little bit dangerous? But as a cinematographer, I also loved that scene as I was filming it, because it sort of captured the precarity of a dog's life, but also the mysteriousness of their minds. But in the footage, I then finally realized there's a moment where she stares back at me and sort of almost like she winks, like, did you get it? And then I realized, as an editor, she actually led us into the traffic because she could sense that it was giving me pleasure to get that scene. And so she was, acting for my benefit and performing for my benefit. And so it was really humbling to realize, I thought I was, making this film about these dogs, but really she was participating in this film in a very active way. And that's something I hope, like you, Kirsten, to take into my next film, that awareness that I didn't have in the field this time, to be more aware of it in the future. And how do you use that in filmmaking?
And good on you for, like, realizing, for like, you can't see it in the moment, but allowing yourself to see it in the edit room and just be like, oh my goodness. I mean, it's really thrilling. I remember so clearly when I was directing a short fiction film, and I, said to the young woman who was acting, okay, that take is fine. And she said, no, it's not. Let's do another one. I was like, no, it's fine. And she was like, no, it's not. And I said, do you know that from what you've experienced? She said, no, anytime you're not really happy, you bite your fingernail. And it was like this first moment of realizing, oh, she's observing me. Like, I'm so intently observing her. And I think we get trained to imagine that directors should know things in advance. And documentary keeps trying to teach us that we are learning in the moment from the people we are interacting with, or the dogs we are interacting with, right? And that sort of, like, lack of stability, it can be really uncomfortable, but I think it's really exciting. And as you say, Elizabeth, it's just so many gifts.
Yeah. And documentary, I feel like it also teaches us that your identity and how you come across to the people outside you matters a lot too, like the Capitol January 6th siege. Who was
That's
filming,
right.
who was engaging with these white supremacists or white nationalists, that mattered, how they reacted to you. And it was very much the case in Istanbul too. Being an outsider had such an influence. And I'm sure the relationships that you had with your subjects is completely informed, of course, by your identity.
Totally. And it allows some things and it doesn't allow other things, but also people are projecting things onto you that you can flip. People assume things about who you are, and sometimes they don't assume, and I think many women filmmakers for many generations have, like, the low expectations have helped us get into situations and allowed things. So I think all of these things, it's like a kind of a jujitsu. It works in many directions, but it's real. and sort of who we are on the inside, who we are on the outside, who is looking at us, who we are looking at. All of those dimensions are activated when we've got a camera.
Yeah.
Thank you. That's so much excitement. I was wondering, one thing is how you found the heart of the story. Was it during filming, or was it in the shooting the film, or was it in the editing room? So Elizabeth, would you like to tell us?
Yeah. Throughout the whole production, the question that haunted us and haunted everyone around me was, whose story are you really telling? Is this a story about humanity, or is this a story about the dogs? And that was something I was constantly grappling with. And in the edit, I think finally what I felt I did was, what I realized is that that was a false dichotomy coming from a cultural perspective that divides and separates the human from every other type of being. And what I realized in editing Zayton's story, as she weaves through different relationships with different people, was that she's a dog, and dogs evolved to be with us and to be around us and to also have their own lives. And we also wouldn't have evolved without them to be who we are. And so our histories on a very biological level are intertwined. And so I feel like the film is a reflection of that, and that this question, is it about humanity or is it about dogs, is a false one, because we're entwined in the same way that we are, a part of all of nature, and that we shouldn't be seeing ourselves as so singular, which is what the film is trying to challenge. That's what I discovered.
For me, the love story was, well, originally we were thinking we were going to make a 5-minute film. And then as I got there and started filming, I realized that there's like a much more profound story at play. And so I learned pretty early on what the heart of the story was going to be. And then it was just kind of this dance of making it a story about the love of nature, but also the balancing the other side with the nature of love, and kind of merging those two together. Because there was the love story between themselves, between Charlie and Lois, but then there was also this love story that they had for their collection and for nature in general. So we really kind of kept trying to weave those back and forth together. And then also they would do, like I said, they would do so many funny things that really spoke to both of those aspects of love, that I really didn't, I just kind of was able to let it unfold naturally.
I started with this cockamamie idea that I was going to kill my father over and over again till he really died for real. But I was certainly, throughout the process, the team of producers, the wonderful Marilyn Ness, Maureen Ryan, Katie Chevigny, kept saying, like, why do you want to kill your dad? And at a certain point, it was like, so that I can resurrect him, so that he can live forever, so that, so that I can hug him at the end of his funeral. But we, at a certain moment realized, like, oh, we've killed him enough times. We don't need to kill him anymore. Now the audience is just afraid he's going to die. And I was battling the entire time this sense that I had started the movie too late, that I had already missed out on the chance to, sort of hold on to the essence of my father, that it was already gone. And I think in many ways, for me, every film is like some battle with my own sort of great sadness about my own impotencies and like what I can't do. And where in this crazy situation, I'd sort of given myself permission to do this thing that no one can do, like no one should want to do, of like killing your father. Like it was like such, the contradictions of it all, I think, were the thing that just kept giving us the next place to go. And it's also, I think, being willing to not know but to try is sort of what led us forward in this story. And also great thanks to Dick Johnson himself.
I think for me, the heart of your story really became just like just this celebration of your father's life, but also the kind of the tragedy of watching it slip away. Was that kind of what you were going for with when you talk about the heart of the
It's
story?
funny because I would have said I'm making it all about my father, and it became obvious to all of us that it's about a relationship, um, and so that meant that I had to bring myself, throw myself under the bus as much as throwing my father under the bus, which led to the sort of scenes of the voiceover and the scenes in the closet, and I think it's just that process. That's what film gives us, is just a process. And if we can just keep staying open to what the process is revealing to us, then so we're able to like let it be all the things that it is.
I think that's such an accurate way to describe the filmmaking process. The film existed almost from the beginning, and it's just like you finding it in the end.
Mhm.
Yeah, not fighting yourself too much. Just like let it go. Let go that thing
Yeah.
you thought you needed to do and let it be
Yeah.
what it is. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, the sound in all of your films is really unique. And um, Kirsten, I remember a scene where Dick, he had on his red jacket and he had just done a stunt in the street and he was talking to your sound lady. She had this great curly hair. So tell us about her, because she was out there and she was part of it. And I loved it when I get to meet people on your crew during the film.
Yeah, I sound people have been among my most important collaborators through my career, and that's Judy Karp, who's worked on hundreds of films, worked on so many documentaries, and she worked on lots of John Sayles films, and she's just hilarious and able, sort of never gonna retire, and she is the person who taught me to, listen while I filmed, along with another sound person named Wellington Bowler. But I always think like directors don't ask enough of sound people. Some people are sort of by nature listening. And so they become quiet and more reserved than a cinematographer who's sort of in active discussion with the director all the time. But, for me, across the board, almost any interview, um, the sound person, if you ask the sound person if they have a question, it's usually the question that goes to the heart of things. So I always encourage directors of like let the cinematographer ask a question and let the sound person ask a question when they're doing interviews. But I do think this great collaboration of filmmaking, it's like everyone needs to pay more attention to the people who've been quieter.
Mm.
Well said.
Yeah, I think sound plays such an important role in the love bugs, and for us, the way we I worked with Billy Woraznik, a sound designer, and he made me appreciate sound more because he keeps this giant library of sounds. He'll go out and record sounds in nature, whether it's the sound of a monsoon storm or the sound of crickets chirping, and he collects them. He creates this giant archive. And so he worked with us a bit. And then we also, our composer used real insect sounds and then asked his musicians to try to mimic those in the studio. So we got, the sound of wings fluttering or the sound of a cicada humming. They would try all sorts of different things. And so it made me kind of appreciate more the impact of sound and the way it can kind of elevate a story.
With us, Ernst Carroll, he lent us his like this bi-directional microphone that would actually capture sound from all directions organically instead of like trying to mimic that in post. And he also, his sort of sound designing philosophy is to try as much as possible to use real authentic sound that was captured during your production. And so that was something, like that collaboration with him was really interesting to me on a sort of aesthetic and ethical level, like the amount of rigor he applies to sound and how authentic it is and how that translates in the end.
Did you put like the directional microphone just like on a street and let it record, or were you doing it while you were filming too?
It was while we were filming, and sometimes, so I would always have a co-producer, either Zeynep Kopperlu, Zeynep Aslanova, or Ceylan Çarhaglu, who are from Istanbul originally. They were they would navigate sort of the human relationships, but also they would record conversations and sounds just around as I was filming.
It was brilliant. It really worked. Well, let me ask you a final question down here. What advice would you have for filmmakers who just want to break free and work from their inner confidence, like each of you are doing, and that's how your films express so much beauty and joy and confidence? They're all uplifting films. What advice could you give to filmmakers? Allison, while you're on, Elizabeth.
Oh,
I'll let Elizabeth go first.
yeah. I would say try not to doubt yourself, although I feel like self-doubt is probably just a part of the process that helps you get to where you need to go. It probably helps you become a stronger filmmaker to have so much doubt. But what I learned by the end of this process of making Stray, and I'm still learning, is there was one point where, test screenings of the film were going so poorly. Like nobody was relating to Zeytin. Nobody was even understood why I decided to make this film. And I remember, and at that point, it was because I had taken in so much input from test screenings, and the cut had become sort of a Frankenstein of many different people's opinions. And what I learned, and my partner told me this, he said, if you're going to fail with this film, at least fail on your own terms. Like, don't fail on other people's terms. And that I took that to heart as I went back into the edit and cut it without showing anybody. And that became the finished film. And I feel like, because I wanted the film, at least if it was going to be an unpopular film, or if it wasn't resonating, or was too idiosyncratic to that other people would find appeal in it, at least it would be the vision I had set out to make. And that is a huge lesson that I've learned, to really take pride in what you wanted to make, because you're a human and other people are human too, it will resonate. And that to fail on your own terms means that you can learn from those mistakes also, rather than other people's terms.
Well done. Thank you.
I think for me, the advice I would give people is to experiment. And the other thing is, if you really want to break free, I think you should. I love to watch a ton of other documentaries, a ton of narrative films. I take notes, which is a little anal, but I do. I keep a whole, here I've got it, my journal full of like all the different theories, like the Coen brothers. Like I'll write down tons and tons of notes, and every time, like I watch a film, I'll write it down in my list of did I like it. And like here I've got Jodie Foster, like her quote was, "The director is in charge of dreaming the dream." So this has really actually quite helped me a lot. So taking tons of notes and then using what you've learned or what you liked from these people, and then experimenting a bit. And if you fail, you fail. But like Elizabeth said, at least you fail on your own terms.
Yes.
I love the way you're both describing playfulness in your filmmaking, and I think it is incredibly difficult for most of us not to be just riddled by self-doubt and worry about it. Because we aspire to make something extraordinary, and it feels like it's not happening while we're doing it. But I totally advocate kindness towards oneself. And it's hard to have while we're making it, but I also feel more and more encouraged to, like, if you create an atmosphere of playfulness with your collaborators, people come. Like, if you're not taking yourself too seriously, then everyone comes and brings more to the game. And in that playfulness, things emerge. So I think treating your collaborators, like imagining that they like the kind of things that you were describing, of like, yeah, give those musicians like sounds of insects and see what they can do with their violin. Like, people are so turned on to be invited to play that that enthusiasm, I think, generates really original work.
Absolutely. Well, I thank you much for all this advice and information. I know our filmmakers will really appreciate it. So thank you, Kirsten and Allison and Elizabeth. It's been so much fun and so enjoyable to get to know all of you. So I just want to thank our audience for joining us, and I encourage you to see these 3 brilliant films. I want to ask you to please support our documentary filmmakers and go to their social networks, go to their websites, support them, click on likes, leave messages, and from theheartproductions.com, we'll have on our own website updates and current information so that you can support them. But what you can do is see Dick Johnson is Dead on Netflix. You can see Love Bugs on POV, and you can see Stray on virtual cinema starting March the 5th. And check back with From the Heart for more information. FromTheHeartProductions.com. Thank you very much for supporting our most important asset, our documentary filmmakers.